Our next speaker is, in continuing this Paleo-Indian Love Fest, is Jim Dunbar.
It's great to be here today. And Andy, this one's for you and the audience. We can't have archaic and eat it too. You wanted a bad pun, you got one. Anyway. Yeah, I think what Andy is saying, I mean, we had some people that went on the dark side of collecting, and we had somebody like Dick Ohms that knew what they were finding underwater was sort of special. They got with Dave Webb, and somehow I hooked up with Dave Webb, and Andy hooked up with Dave Webb. I'd never met Dick Ohms myself, Andy did, but I think the underwater archaeological resources that are a prehistoric age in Florida are phenomenal, and that's my bias, and I'll shut up now. Let me see if I know how to work this. This is a theoretical Paleo-Indian scene near a sinkhole. We call it Wakulla Springs, 14,500 years ago. Oh. Okay.
The right to advance,
yeah.
The left to go back.
Okay. But at Wakulla Springs, and what I'm going to try to do is just sort of run through the land excavations at Wakulla Springs, and Wilford T. Neal in 1958 dug the Silver Springs or Paradise Park site, and from that and found Clovis. At first he called them Swanee in deference to John Goggin, but he knew there were Clovis and then corrected that later on. But everybody since then that I know about has been looking for a site that had more than one Paleo-Indian component and ideally early archaic components stacked on top of that. Well, there it is, the first I know of in the state of Florida. We've got Kirk serrated Wassissa, Kirk corner notch, and the Boland sets, Dalton, Clovis, Simpson, and we can just say, I don't know where those fit in yet. To be announced. I don't know if they're older or not. But to start the Wakulla story at least, Dan Morris's dad, who was, I think Dan Morris is in the audience. Right, yeah. Anyway, his dad took a picture of this Simpson Point in 1971 or 2, I believe. And it is at the Wakulla Springs Lodge, and it was laid in the upper max of a mastodon. When the state was buying the property years later, somebody decided they needed that point, and it's disappeared. We'll probably never ever see it again. And then in 1995, the late Calvin Jones decided he would help a construction crew, and he dug the sewer line behind the lodge on the north side overlooking the spring with a group of volunteers, and one of the artifacts he uncovered is this large Simpson preform. And he reckoned it was Simpson, and so did Louis Tesser. When Calvin unfortunately died before it could be written up, and Louis Tesser took the data and wrote it up. In 2008, we got a National Geographic grant to go back in and try to date the site for the first time using a relatively new technique, optically stimulated luminescence. And we did find, I don't know if you can, whoop, what did I just do? Oh, never mind, this thing does more things than, well, you can't see, but up the top star in test B is a Clovis blade, and that came at about 1.12 meters or something. No, it came at it right at 1 meter deep, and then the other red star was a scraper that came at, it seems like it was about 1.15 meters down, which we thought was a Simpson Point level at the time, and we got OSL dates back. And if you like, say it's 10,000 years and then it's plus or minus 1,000, that doesn't really tighten things up. And I'm not going to go bore you with OSL dating technique, techno-speak. So we came back in 2017 and 2018, and you can see over towards the west some blue squares that we dug on land. The light blue squares just outside the Wakulla Lodge were Calvin Jones's test units when he dug the sewer trench. The green test units we did in 2008. The red test units we did in 2018, and way out offshore in that yellow block is the Vickery Mastodon. So they're not too far apart. So one of the first things that happened as a result of the 2008 work, there were some issues with the OSL dating of the site. And Dave Thullman had recently read an article by Walter Schenkel about the movement of sand caused by harvester ants. And Walter Schenkel has a little place out in the Apalachicola forest called Ant Heaven. So we went out and tested how much sand does a harvester ant move. And we did find that harvester ants can move sand up and down the column, but if you're going to OSL date something, you're reliant on the fact that in burial, it's never seen the sunlight. And what Jack and his group found is that the harvester ants will bring grains of sand from depth up into higher chambers, and it can screw up the carbon dating. I mean, not the carbon dating, but the OSL dating. So you do get a bit of bioturbation. This is an harvester ant bed in the Spring Warrior Creek Mound, Black Midden. And what you're looking at is the harvester ants. They don't usually do this, but they brought all these, small minnow bones from the from the midden deposit to the surface, so they can move things around. They just wanted to get rid of those things so they could have a normal nest, I guess. And at Wakulla Springs, we came across that little critter. It's called a gold head digger wasp, and they will dig holes. They're not a predator as such, but they look for katydids in the summer, and they'll sting them and stun them and drag them down under the ground and then lay larval eggs into the things, and the poor katydid is sucked clean, and you have another generation of harvester wasps. And we found evidence of micro bioturbation, if you want to call it, at Wakulla Springs. There's no doubt, and that's one of the culprits right there. Another thing we found is that either by hurricane or by heavy equipment, when you pull a tree out of the ground, you cause a more substantial type of damage. And one of the things we found out, Ed Ball, before he passed in 1971, made an all-record hit with the Audubon Society of America by channelizing the spring and also root raking and bulldozing a part of the spring that's grown back up and gone back to nature. But in doing so, he pulled a lot of trees out of the ground. And that's my example of a hurricane blown down tree. They do cause disturbance. So these were our tests from 2018, and you'll see over in P22 down in the bottom corner the orange bug caches. We found caches of small tree beetles, and every one of them had a little hole popped in them, and most of them had some kind of larval wasp thing going on again, but we found them at depth, a meter, more than a meter down in the ground. And we thought that might be paleo-environmental evidence, got a carbon date on them, and they're modern. In another instance, we had a hickory nut, you'll see in P24 there, and they dated modern, but there was a reason for that. And this was from an earlier test unit in 2017, but in the bottom of it, you'll see part of an archaic projectile point pointing straight up to the sky, and that was where a tree had uprooted either by a hurricane or a bulldozer, either one. It didn't matter, it just happened. And in the test units P24 and P22, on one side of it, seems like both were maybe on the north wall or something like that, north face, you can see the ground has been disturbed. And the normal profile would be a 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, and we had some disturbance. So we go to radiocarbon dating. And I'll get back to the disturbance here in a bit. And I like to call this one when radiocarbon dates fail. Sometimes assumptions are a trap to fall for. And the late Calvin Jones and Louis Tesser assumed that a feature they found, feature 7, was a cache of calcined bone. So we thought we had calcined bone, and if you have fully calcined bone, that means the bone burned. It burned to the extent it sort of loses its bone characteristic, but it freezes inside that and protects it, the fossil fuel that burned it to begin with, and the residue of the bone. And it will give you an accurate carbon date if you have that. But if it is not fully calcined, it will not give you a good date. It will always be too young. And I think that's what happened to us. Before I get off of feature 7, I just want to say that feature 7 had a red ochre cap. I know of no early archaic site in the southeast that's a burial that has red ochre associated with it. However, there are Paleo-Indian burials that have red ochre, and I would point out that that's the deepest feature anybody has found at Wakulla Springs at 1.5 meters to 2 meters below the surface. So, and then out away from that, outside the feature, a biface at 1.37 meters down and scrapers and so forth. So there's artifacts down at depth, and we don't know how old they are. And the feature, unfortunately, is gone. And I'm going to go back and look at the feature. It's in the Bureau of Archaeological Research collections. So one of the things we did in our testing, the blue circles on that side are OSL date, but on the P22 side, you'll see little ellipses that are different colors. We did alkaline test of the soil. Most sandy soils in Florida are highly acidic, and bone will not preserve. But the Aucilla alpine sand that we had at Wakulla is an exception to that. The limestone's close enough to the surface. When we got about 1 meter down, it was tending towards neutral to slightly alkaline. And that's where you get bone preservation. And so the idea that we had, calcined bone, I don't think is the case. As a matter of fact, if you can see all the red dots way over, all the way across, these are test units that have yielded small bone fragments nonetheless in these units. So I think bone preservation at depth on land at Wakulla is ubiquitous. And it's not caused by burning. It is just the natural condition of the sediment. So this is a close-up of our test units again. And I'm mainly going to be talking about P22, 3, P24, and 5, which was 2018. When we excavated, this is P22 and 3, and I won't bore you too long with this, but it shows artifact counts on one side and artifact weights on the other. And you can see below, say, 1.15 meters, there are some spikes. You can have, most of the debitage we had was extremely small. Same thing here. You see down at 145, we had a cone of force blocky chunk, a biface thinning flake, and some other things. And, but the most important thing is something called the PT anomaly, which throughout North America and now throughout South America, people are finding the PT anomaly. And in the Greenland ice core, the thing dates, I think it's like 12,896 plus or minus 4 years or something ridiculously tight like that. With radiocarbon dating, it's a little looser, but what I'm talking about, these internationally are places where there is evidence of some kind of extraterrestrial airburst or impact. And the best way to detect it now, the cheapest and most cost-effective way to detect it now, is looking for rare earth platinum dust in the stratigraphic profile. We found it in every test unit at Wakulla Springs that was dug deeper than a meter. And the PT anomaly almost always occurred right at a meter, and that's where we got that Clovis blade. So I think we have a good Clovis level there. So in P23, we found a Bolin point, and it was at, I think, about 1.4 meters down, but it, to my money, had been displaced. We were doing strike and dips on the artifacts, and if you'll notice, this Bolin point had iron oxide staining on both sides. I believe, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, the average Bolin point, the majority of Bolin points are found higher up in the column, somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 80 centimeters below the surface, maybe is 85, something like that. So I think this guy had fallen from place for whatever the reason. And then we found this turtleback below it at about 1.7 meters, if I remember correctly. And it doesn't have the oxide staining on both sides. It just has it on one side. That would be the downward facing side. So the crown of that turtleback scraper was facing up and the flat underbelly of it was down. And then at about a 1.9 meters or 10 down, we got this huge scraper. I mean, it's bigger than the palm of your hand. And it's on a very thin flake. It's a scraper with a graver spur point. And we believe this belongs to the Swanee tool assemblage. And I'm not Swanee, but the Simpson tool assemblage. And the only thing I can say, of the tools that we found at Wakulla Springs, only one's sort of small. The rest of them are humongous, in my opinion. They like big lithic tools, and they like to find good chert. We're not sure what kind of chert this is, and maybe Adam Burke and somebody else can help us ID the source. And then we finally got one. This is the first Simpson point ever to be recovered in stratigraphic context. Not to be confused with a Swanee. There's a wasted Swanee point. They're thicker, they're chunkier, they're made in a different way. This is primarily a percussion struck. If you see an early stage one of these, you'll find a lot of flakes like that one big flake you see on one side. They're trying to not go overshot, they're trying to go 3/4 shot and thin that thing. And I believe this is a knife. Look how thin that thing is. I do not think that's a projectile point. I think it would be hafted down here and a very weak thing to be throwing at something. It would snap on the base. But here are artifacts that are Simpson or older from the site. And the big preform that Calvin dug up, no iron oxide stain on one side, iron oxide stain on the other. The Simpson point, same deal, even though it's weaker. And we had sent, by the way, the Simpson point in to see if we could detect any blood residue. And in doing that, it sort of bleaches out the point, so you're not really seeing the true color of the point from having done that testing, and they didn't find anything, by the way. But again, there's the Clovis blade that came right at the PT anomaly in 2008, but we didn't know about the PT anomaly in 2008, and some other tools. And we sort of visualized that this could be the case, that they used that big Simpson preform to get big flakes. That big flake that came off that bigger preform could have been reduced down to a small projectile point, and then the Simpson itself starts out as this big wide sort of fishtail point and ends up like the one we excavated. I think that Simpson Point we recovered in place had been totally used up. If they tried to flake it one more time, it was going to break. And of course the big scraper tool. And this is sort of the oddball thing about that Simpson Point. They're using primarily percussion to thin the thing. The thing needs to be very thin. But look at those things where the yellow arrows are. That's punch flaking. For those of you that don't know this, punch flaking is what amateur flint knappers do because they have a problem with stepped hinge fractures. And I think they're making a Simpson Point. They want to get it really thin and really flat. It gets to the point where they can use it as a knife. It needs to be resharpened. And they try to get these flakes off, and they'll have a step fracture up there, and it looks like they're coming in with maybe an osseous rod or something and punching those things off. Is there other evidence in the Simpson Point assemblage, which there are only like 27 in the state of Florida? Yes, they're using this punch flake thing. And I talked to Bruce Bradley about it, and we haven't got into the heavy research yet. But he said if they're using that, that's a unique trait of Simpson. He'd not heard of that anywhere. So where are we in time? The Clovis Interval is shown there on the arrows. And the Wakulla Springs Lodge site, there's a pretty big, broad span. We're relying on the fact that the PT anomaly occurs at about 1 meter, and the Simpson Point assemblage occurs at about 1.10 meters below the surface, and that is a time difference. But we don't know where it fits in time. And just one more point of interest, and this really deals with some of the research that both Andy and I did. And we're back to the Vickery Mastodon site. And the carbon dates he was talking about, he got on the sediment where the mastodon came from. And by the way, that long pencil-looking thing out there beyond the blocked-out test units, that's a canoe. People never knew it was there because eelgrass was growing and hiding it. And now that all that's died off, this canoe was just laying on the bottom like a sore thumb. It dates to the Deptford period, about 300 BC, if I remember correctly. But anyway, from the 1 meter that Andy successfully dug, we have these 3 carbon dates. So I got the reverse stratigraphy. The deepest level was 13.5, and the youngest level is 12.5. And the mastodon appears to be somewhere between 13.5 and 13 calendar. So you have to visualize Florida as it looked back in the Pleistocene. So Wakulla Springs was nowhere near the coastline of today. Okay. Yeah. And this is the Econfina River channel. It's dry in 2007 due to a drought. And from Page Latson earlier, came up with this water table chart. And anyway, I'll get to this last slide. It would now appear that during the Allerød, just before the Clovis and during the Clovis times, Florida's rivers were flowing. they may have actually been flowing at a higher rate than they do today. And because of that, if you look at the Florida Wetlands Inventory, what a glorious place that would have been for Clovis people. And yes, you get Clovis sites all the way across the top of the Swanee River, all the way down the Swanee, up to Santa Fe. Anyway, I just think this environmental proxy of water table is important, and because it's happened now at Page Latson, at Wakulla, and there's a fella in the audience here, Ben Tanner. I won't bore you with anything, but he's cored a bunch of springs and he's finding the same dates. Anyway, thank you very much.